half an hour away from this location, but who is the president of the largest Muslim Brotherhood Front organization in America. It's called the Islamic Society of North America. Nothing could be more explicit than the president seeks to align this country not with Israel, not with our friends, not with our allies, but with our sworn and determined enemies. This is why I fear we are witnessing him propelling us towards the next horrific war, and it must not be allowed to happen.
Who was he sitting next to, that imam, by the way?
I don't know who he was sitting next to. Do you know the answer?
I believe it was the secretary.
It may well have been.
And Pamela, to take that horrendous scenario and have a positive look at the follow-up steps, General Boykin, Frank, myself, and some others are going to be working formally, and this is maybe the first time this is being said, with some major Tea Party leaders to develop a cohesive, coherent policy on Israel, because they now have recognized the importance of not just the bread and butter issues, but in 2012, 6 November, somebody's going to have a national security policy and they want to weigh in on it. So that's an exciting new development.
Yeah, I also head up, Bishop E.W. Jackson, I also head up the Conservative Emergency Task Force, which is made up of Tea Party leaders, social conservatives, national security conservatives. Frank has joined in with us, and so many others. This is now being moved to the top of our agenda. And we're going to be working with Janet and working with Frank and with anybody else who understands what grave danger Israel is being put in, and really what grave danger our own country is being put in.
Another question? Yes.
Hi, Faith McDonald from the Institute on Religion and Democracy. And first let me say that IRD also stands with Israel. This past Sunday, our Old Testament scripture reading in church was from Isaiah 37. It's the story about the siege of Jerusalem and when Sennacherib of Assyria was against King Hezekiah. And one of the things that's referenced, and which I've heard a lot more about through history, is that the Pharaoh, the Nubian Pharaoh, the Sudanese Pharaoh of Egypt, came to the rescue of Jerusalem, King Taharka. And I say all that just to say that Israel is facing the same enemy that many people in the world who are persecuted for being Christians are facing, particularly today, the people of Sudan. Right after this announcement by President Obama, this demand, whatever you want to call it.
Excuse me, do you have a question?
Yes,
okay.
I'm getting to it right now.
Okay.
Right after his statement, Khartoum bombed Abyei in Sudan and also did some other things. My question is, do you feel that there are more things like this, more actions that Obama's statement has emboldened Islamists in other parts of the world to make?
Well, let General, if you want to come up. I just wanted to mention that when Tom spoke, I was reminded, Tom Trento, of some of the emboldenment that has happened. We saw in Fort Lauderdale, there were people who were coming out, and the kinds of things that were being said, the signs were being held, were bring back the ovens. These are people who want the extinction of the Jewish race, and they are absolutely emboldened. We had seen it in churches, in pro-Israel churches, like Pastor Hagee and others, and I think it's only just begun with what has just happened. General?
Yeah, it's a good question. If you look at the statements that have come out from Muslim leaders since the President's announcement of the 67 orders requirement for peace, they have all been focused on the fact that they believe that the President has made a very positive decision in support of the, quote, Palestinians. And let me simply remind you of this. Jews were Palestinians as well. It's not just Arabs. So we need to call these people what we are really talking about, which are Muslim Arabs. They can't hate Israel any more than they already do. They have been encouraged by this, just based on the statements that we're hearing from Muslim leaders. And the fact of the matter is also that they fire rockets and sometimes missiles into Israel every day. This is a daily occurrence. You have to be in Israel for some period of time. A Holy Land tour is a great thing. I encourage everybody to do it. But you have to live there. You have to be there on a constant basis to understand what the Israeli people live with today. They live with the threat of a missile being fired, a rocket being fired, or a sniper or a body bomb on somebody on a bus every single day. This is what they live with today. What's it going to be like if they did return to the 67 borders? They are living with the threat of death every single day, but they go on about their lives. They're not going to hate Israel anymore. They are, in fact, encouraged now, and I think that you will see just a continuation of what they've been living with all along. In fact, if anything, you might see a temporary cessation of that. You may see a reduction in the number of attacks on Israel in the short term as a way of not disrupting that, not feeding the concerns of people like us that are standing up here today. But we have to understand what it's like to be an Israeli and to live in a country where you are one missile away from death. And they live with it all the time.
Rich Swire from redcounty.com. I have two questions. One, the president, when he gave his speech yesterday at AIPAC, he used the word contiguous. He said that, quote, the Palestinian people must have the right to govern themselves in a sovereign and contiguous state. Would someone please address that? Because a number of the delegates to AIPAC are highly concerned about that word contiguous.
What he's talking about is taking this area here that is called Gaza and extending it to be a contiguous border with essentially what would be the Palestinian territories here. We're talking about cutting Israel in half. A contiguous border. We're talking about cutting it in half. Right now, the areas where the majority of the Arab Muslims are located are in fact in two separate areas. And remember that when Prime Minister Netanyahu negotiates on peace settlements, he is negotiating with Fatah, not with Hamas. They are separated, the Gaza Strip and then, of course, the West Bank. Contiguous means we join those two. That is, cuts Israel in half, literally.
I have a follow-up question for both Mr. Gaffney and for the General. There is a movement to have the UN recognize a Palestinian state. Will that document use the President's speeches and his position to define what they think is a Palestinian state?
I'll let Frank answer part of this. Let me tell you what I see, and this is, and I don't think this is off subject at all. One of the major issues associated with the no-fly zone that was established in Libya was the fact that we responded to an international requirement without telling our own Congress. Okay, what does that portend? It portends that now we're committing U.S. military force not based on internal requirements, but based on an international requirement, which is, I believe, a step towards the global governance. Now, having said that, and I think Frank wrote a very good article about this, what we need to be concerned about now is when the Palestinians go to the United Nations and ask for a no-fly zone to protect them from these Israeli jets, which are very precise, very targeted against places where rockets and missiles are being fired or against known Hamas headquarters. When they go in and say, we need a no-fly zone, what's the potential now that we've responded to the UN already in committing military force? What's the potential that we'll do that again? I think that's one of the concerns. Should be.
Before addressing that specific question, let me respond also to what the General said a moment ago in response to the earlier question. The only way to create a contiguous Palestinian state is to make a unified state discontiguous. Is that what we have in mind? Has anybody said that's what we are proposing to do to Israel? To make it at its narrowest not only 9 miles, which is why the Joint Chiefs of Staff quite properly said it cannot be defended, but also to cut it in half so that it cannot defend its north and its south simultaneously. This is This is simply disconnected from reality. And why I worry so much about war being the upshot of it is when people behave this way, particularly people like the President of the United States, it creates perceptions. And the perceptions may be completely wrong, but more often than not throughout history, people act on the basis of perceptions in ways that are, well, murderous. And I fear that's what's coming. The specific scenario of this fall's agenda for the Palestinians and their friends involves going to the United Nations Security Council to get a formal recommendation from the Security Council for the recognition of a new member state, Palestine. Now, the President has kind of, sort of, I guess, said he doesn't think that's a good idea, leading some people to think he will veto it. I'm willing to make a bet right now that this president will approve the recognition by the United Nations Security Council of a Palestinian state, because I believe where he has come from, he is going to think that this is the moment for him to do for the Palestinians, this much beleaguered, downtrodden people, what Harry Truman did for the Jews in recognizing the state of Israel. And maybe you're wrong about this. I pray I'm wrong about this, because that will only further capitalize the kind of danger that I'm talking about. But with or without a formal approval, or perhaps an abstention by the United States, which might have the same effect, the UN General Assembly will overwhelmingly support the recognition of such a state of Palestine. And I think, as Jerry has indicated, that will almost certainly result in people like Samantha Power, the President's advisor in the National Security Council, who got us into Libya on the grounds of what she calls, and others have called, a responsibility to protect, will insist that we do the same for the Palestinians, and that will trigger, I'm convinced, the next horrific regional war.
And I hope I'm wrong about this, but if you look at my name is Aaron Free, and I'm a pastor of Knollwood Church in Mobile, Alabama. But I hope I'm wrong about this. But if we talk about moving Israel back to its 1967 lines and borders, it would the landmass of Israel will be the size of the city of Houston. And talk to any military expert, as General Jerry Boykin, they all say the word indefensible. And I hope I'm wrong about this, but I think there's a code. I think 67 borders is a code word for the real intent behind the President's mission, and that is the absolute destruction of the nation of Israel. Because if it is indefensible, and he's calling to go back to those borders, knowing that it is indefensible, I believe what the President of the United States said last week was that I am intent on destroying the nation of Israel.
There was one point I wanted to make, and Mark, if you would hold that little thing. People say, well, 67 borders, what's so bad about that? They must have done it then. It's a different world now. Now these missiles can be launched right from where those borders they want to draw them, and the 70% of the people of the state of the nation of Israel. And so it didn't used to be that the terrorists were so well organized. It didn't used to be that those missiles could hit the target. So it's even more indefensible. It's even more putting Israel in more peril than ever before. And someone has said that this would basically mean that Israel could last for about 3 weeks. I think is what most have said. This is a horrendous idea, and we stand against it, united for Israel. Any other questions? Yes.
Mark, make one further point on
Sure.
this.
This is a special topographic map, which is a raised relief
You're going to
map.
have to use the mic.
Oh, I'm sorry.
The map first.
Okay, I'm sorry. This is a special raised relief topographic map of Israel, where you actually can see that the West Bank is really not just a shallow salient to the Jordan River, but is in fact a mountain range that is sitting upon, as we said before, and as the general said, 70% of Israel's population, 80% of her industrial base. So this is the high ground. And there was another time in history when someone who was very well-meaning forced another country to give up a mountain range. And that mountain range was the Sudetenland of Czechoslovakia. The Sudetenland of Czechoslovakia was forced to be given to Nazi Germany's Hitler, which was in fact the very crystallizing element which led us to World War II. And forcing Israel to give up the strategic high ground is as reckless and as propelling us to a war as Neville Chamberlain's forcing Czechoslovakia to cede this strategic high ground. Additionally, one more point of what that currently the high ground is important. One only needs to refer to Ben Dien Phu, which is when the Vietnamese had the high ground early before the Vietnam War, and from that high ground routed the French out of that area, which in fact was the beginning of the Vietnam War. So with respect to this is not a peace process. This is a war process that is propelling us to a terrible, terrible war where we are going to be at a terrible risk to the Muslims that will wipe Israel out in short order with these borders. And again, this is just the same rockets that are now flying into a relatively barren area similar to North Dakota, where it's not really hitting anything, as opposed to rockets that are flying into Midtown Manhattan, where you have Al-Qaeda having sovereignty over Queens.
Can I make one more point? This isn't unfortunately just about rockets. You have the high ground, you can move in force against Israel. But above and beyond the military elements of this challenge, those high grounds of the West Bank and the high grounds of the Golan Heights, which we haven't really even talked about at all, are the aquifers upon which Israel desperately depends for its survival in a desert region. Were Israel to lose the waters of those areas, I don't know whether it's 3 weeks or a month or 6 months, but it's not very long before it is unable to ensure the survival of its people. Again, what are we thinking? In making these glib promises that there will be defensible borders when they are absolutely impossible of being defensible. What are we thinking when we say there will be two states that will live side by side in peace and security, when one of those states will be determined to destroy the other and will have the means to do it by virtue of the high ground, by virtue of the strategic depth that is given up, and by virtue of the aquifers that are moved into enemy hands?
The question was asked before about when the president makes these types of concessions, these unilateral concessions to the Arab Muslim world, does it have an effect? And the answer is, of course, it emboldens them. I'd just like to take a moment to explain why I think it emboldens them. You see, the Western secular mind does not really understand what motivates the religious Muslim mind. The Western secular mind says, well, listen, if we offer compromise and we show goodwill, then in return the other side will show goodwill to us and will also compromise. No, we're not dealing with Canadians. We're not dealing with Scandinavians. We're dealing with the people who, in its religious outlook, says that if the other side is compromised, that means that that came about because Allah is on our side. It's a victory for Allah, and that emboldens them further. So we make a big mistake when we think to continually, not just in the Israel Arab-Muslim situation offer compromise, but in all these situations when the West offers compromises and they think that that will be perceived and then reciprocated with goodwill, on the contrary, they just dig the hole deeper, because in the Muslim mind, they say, my goodness, we have hardly any armies. We don't have rockets to match Israel or America, and yet they're giving in? Ah, that must be a miracle from Allah. It's a sign from Allah. He's on our side. And that makes them even more intransigent, and it emboldens them further. The last thing I'd like to say, I don't think I mentioned it before, it's called Judenrein. I talked about resettlement of Jews and deporting Jews and ethnic cleansing. But when you have a president or you have a world council that says that this area of the world where Jews are now has to be Judenrein, free of Jews, you understand what that means and when that happened before. The world would never accept a situation where we would tell Muslims that they must leave en masse by the hundreds of thousands from an area. That would be called racist Islamophobia. But when you do it to Jews, which is to demand a Judenrein, that's a German word, my friends, a Judenrein situation, then all of a sudden, that's not racist. That's not Jewish phobia. And I guess because in our politically correct times, there's no such thing as Jewish phobia, and racism can only be against certain groups. And unfortunately, the Israelis are not part of those preferred groups.
Make one last point.
We need Mike to answer. We need to take the question.
Just a very quick clarification on this, because I don't want anybody to walk away thinking that we're assuming that the Palestinians all by themselves would be able to destroy Israel. Certainly not initially, though perhaps by cutting off the water that would go a long way. But what we've seen happen again and again and again, and what the Joint Chiefs of Staff looked at in 1967, as I mentioned earlier, was at the prospect that they will be joined in a new war against Israel by the states that neighbor Israel, and others perhaps beyond. And again, we don't have to speculate about this. This has happened repeatedly. And this is why I make this point about perceptions being so worrying. This is why I make the point about the Muslim Brotherhood's embrace by the United States being so worrying, is that we're getting into a position where not only are these nations that do have tanks, that do have aircraft, that do have bigger rockets, that in the case of Iran may soon have nuclear weapons, will be emboldened to believe that they now can destroy Israel, something that they have not been able to do despite repeated efforts to this point. And in the end, the key determinant may be their perception that the United States will not stand with Israel, and therefore they can get away with this. We mustn't let them have that misimpression.
You asked a question a little while ago and you said, what's next? What are you going to do next? And as I think about in the country, there's a lot of people that doesn't realize what's going on. President Obama does not speak for me. My heart is with Israel. And I think as I work with Boys Without Fathers from the ages of 10 to 18 all over the country. And I look at my kids and my grandkids. How are we going to leave this to them if we don't do everything possible, spend time and work and come together is what we have to do. So, we're going to keep working. Janet, you want to take
Let me make just a sort of final thing that I will say. One of the most famous photographs in Israel is a photograph of an Israeli airborne unit on the 7th of June, 1967, as they stood at the Temple Mount for the first time in 2,000 years. Israeli military gave me an audio tape of the radio traffic between the headquarters of that airborne unit and the commander on the ground as they went into the city, the old city, and took the Temple Mount. And the emotion in the voice of the airborne commander as he came to the Temple Mount, and the shofars blowing in the background and the cheers from the Israeli soldiers, was one of the most emotional things that I have ever heard in my life. And every time I play it, it stirs my emotions. Because prophecy told the Jews that the day would come when they would be called from the east and the west and the north and the south, and Israel would be their home, and Jerusalem would be their capital. We now see the Western Wall. We see Jews praying at the Western Wall. We see people putting notes in the Western Wall. For 2,000 years, they were unable to do that. And in the 67 war, on the 7th of June, they took the Temple Mount. And prophecy was fulfilled. Whether you believe in biblical prophecy or not, you can't deny that the Bible said it was going to happen, and it did happen. And those Jews were back at their most holy site. The idea that we as a nation would insist that the Jews give up that Temple Mount, which under international law, forget the Bible for a minute, under international law is their territory. Because they were attacked and they seized that as a result of that attack. But the idea that we would tell the Jews to give up their holy sites, we would never say to a Muslim, give up Mecca or Medina, which, by the way, were Jewish enclaves. Until the armies of Muhammad literally slaughtered and subjugated the Jews. The idea that we would tell those Jews, you can no longer pray at the Western Wall, your most holy site, is an incredible, incredible thing to me. May God forgive us if we keep telling the Jews to give up their holy site.
We just want to thank you all for coming. One more question? One more question. We'll do one more question, then we're going to be here. If some of you need to get some phone numbers, we've got to run to another meeting, but go ahead.
I'm Bill Langfan, Mark's father. How heavily do you expect to hit Congress with your numbers? I think that's the area that we really have to hit hard, because we have a government that has three different echelons.
One of the question was how are we planning and how hard are we going to plan on hitting Congress? One of the gentlemen who was here, Rick Scarborough, is actually meeting in Congress right now. Our request is that we stand with Israel, that we see a resolution to stand with Israel, that we see Congress stand with Israel, and we have seen the isolated responses in opposition to what the President has said. And we're going to see if there'll be a joint effort, and that's what we're working on now. Anybody else have anything they'd like to add? Sure. Aaron?
Yes, something significant here. You know, there's a lot of groups that support Israel. But what's significant about this group is it started with the gentleman over to my right, Mike Godfrey, who's a very unlikely candidate to support Israel. He was, you probably know his face. He was one of the top college sports football analysts for ESPN for 19 years. He was the coach of Ohio, and then with ESPN, and somehow God put this burden on his heart, and he called Janet, and Janet made some calls, and in 19 days, this group has all gotten together, but it started with a football coach. So I think there is a grassroots effort going on here that's not just your likely subjects. I think Americans are concerned with what's happening towards Israel right now.
So if you leave with one message, it's that Israel, you are not alone. We stand with you, and we do it by the millions. We'll be here afterwards for questions.
I just have one thing to say. I'm not really anybody. I'm a Boca Raton Jew.
Thank you. Bless you. Thank you for coming. We'll be here. We'll be here if you need to speak with anybody individually.
John?